The assembly hall was massive, and Daniel Hayes had never seen anything like it in his entire life. He sat in a chair that was designed for humans but felt uncomfortable anyway, because everything in this place was built to accommodate 73 different species, and none of them had the same body shape. To his left were the Vexrathi, who looked like walking crystals that hummed and glowed with different colors depending on their mood. To his right were the Quallen, who breathed water instead of air, and spoke through some kind of special chamber that made bubbling sounds into words. Daniel adjusted his tie and looked down at his datapad where he had all his notes prepared for today's emergency meeting. Lisa Morgan sat next to him, and she was frantically going through diplomatic protocols because this was only their third year and the Galactic Council and humans were still learning how everything worked. Earth was the newest member, and everyone knew it. Most of the species in this room had been traveling between stars for thousands of years, before humans even figured out how to make fire. Some of them had been part of the council for so long that they remembered when other species were new, and now those species were considered ancient too. Daniel felt the weight of representing his entire planet, and he tried not to think about how many ways this could go wrong. The meeting had been called because there were problems in the outer rim sectors, and everyone was worried about territory disputes. Ambassador Zexthal from the Krivian Empire was speaking, and he was not happy about something. The Krivians looked like giant insects with 6 arms and compound eyes that saw in directions humans couldn't even imagine. Zexthal waved 4 of his arms around while he talked, and his words came through the translator as smooth sentences, even though Daniel knew he was actually making clicking and whistling sounds. The translator technology was amazing, and it made everyone sound calm even when they were clearly angry. Thal said that no single species could threaten the Council's stability and that they had maintained peace for 11,000 cycles, which was a really long time. Daniel did some quick math in his head and realized that was longer than all of human recorded history. These beings had been living in peace since before humans built the pyramids, and they were very proud of it. He understood why they would be. 11,000 years without a major war was impressive by any standard, and especially impressive when you had 73 different species all trying to share the same galaxy. Lisa leaned over and whispered to Daniel, asking him what he was thinking. She knew that look on his face, and it usually meant he was about to say something that would either be brilliant or get them both in serious trouble. Daniel whispered back that he was just observing, but Lisa didn't look convinced. She had worked with him long enough to know when he was planning something. He gave her a small smile and went back to watching the debate unfold in front of them. Another ambassador stood up, and this one was named Morpheus from the Quallen species. His water chamber made rippling sounds as he spoke and asked if the human representative had any insights on conflict prevention. Morpheus mentioned Earth's recent unification wars, and Daniel felt everyone in the room turn to look at him. It was like being in a spotlight, except the spotlight had multiple eyes, and some of those eyes could see wavelengths of light that humans couldn't detect. He felt exposed and analyzed and judged all at the same time. This was the moment where he had to decide whether to play it safe or tell the truth. Daniel stood up slowly and smoothed down his coat. He thanked Morpheus for the question and said that Earth's perspective was probably unique because humans were so new to interstellar politics. He said they had spent a lot of time studying the council dynamics since they were admitted, and he chose his words very carefully because he knew what was about to happen. The Vexrathi delegate asked what he meant by studying, and her voice sounded like breaking glass, which was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Her crystalline body was glowing orange, which Lisa had told him meant curiosity mixed with suspicion. Daniel explained that Earth's diplomatic corps operated under something called prepared engagement, and that they believed in understanding all potential scenarios. He could feel the room getting quieter as he spoke. Zexthal leaned forward with his compound eyes glittering in the light and asked what scenarios Daniel was talking about. The Krivian ambassador's tone suggested he already suspected the answer and wasn't going to like it. Daniel paused and looked at Lisa, who touched his sleeve in warning, but he had already made his decision. The question had been asked directly, and avoiding it would only make things worse. Later, he said that the Earth Defense Initiative required comprehensive, strategic planning, and that this included contingency protocols. The room got even quieter, and Daniel could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. Morpheus asked what the contingency protocols were for, and his water chamber rippled with what looked like concern. Daniel took a breath and met the Quallen ambassador's gaze steadily. He said the protocols were for every species in this room, and then he waited for the explosion he knew was coming. The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like 3 hours. Daniel could see delegates processing what he had just said, and he watched as understanding dawned on their faces, or whatever they had instead of faces. Then everyone started talking at once, and the translation system struggled to keep up with all the different voices. Some delegates were standing up and gesturing wildly, while others were rapidly communicating with their home governments using devices Daniel didn't recognize. The Vexrathi delegate's color shifted to bright red, and the Krevian ambassador was on his feet, with all 6 arms moving in what looked like aggressive patterns. Ambassador Zexthal's voice cut through the noise, demanding to know if Daniel was suggesting that Earth had military plans against council members. His translator made him sound outraged and insulted and deeply concerned all at the same time. Daniel remained standing with his shoulders relaxed and his hands at his sides in a non-threatening posture. Lisa had gone pale next to him, but she was already pulling up documents on her datapad to support whatever direction this conversation went. She was a professional, and Daniel was grateful to have her there. Daniel said they were not military plans but contingency plans, and that there was a significant difference between the two. The council arbiter, who was a floating ball of energy named Lux, pulsed with blue light and called for order. The arbiter said that the human ambassador would explain, and everyone else would listen. Daniel nodded his thanks and prepared to tell the entire Galactic Council exactly what Earth had been doing for the past 3 years. Daniel stood in the center of attention while voices erupted all around him, and the translation systems worked overtime to convert 70 different languages into something everyone could understand. The noise was overwhelming, and he could see that some delegates were angry while others looked confused, and a few seemed almost impressed by what he had just admitted. Ambassador Zexthal was the loudest, and all 6 of his arms were moving in patterns that Daniel's cultural briefings had taught him meant severe displeasure. The Krevian was demanding to know how Earth dared to create military plans against council members, and his compound eyes were fixed on Daniel, like he was examining a particularly interesting insect. The council arbiter pulsed with calming blue light, and the chamber slowly quieted down because when Lux wanted silence, everyone gave it. The floating energy being had been orbiting council meetings for longer than most species had been spacefaring, and everyone respected that authority. Lux announced that the human ambassador would explain himself, and that everyone else would listen without interruption. Daniel felt grateful for the intervention because he needed time to explain this properly before someone decided Earth was a threat that needed to be removed from the council, or worse. Daniel took a breath and said that these were not military plans but contingency plans, and that the difference was important. He explained that when Earth had unified their governments and prepared to join the galactic community, they had done so with their eyes open. They studied every major conflict in council history going back 3,000 years, which was as far back as the public records went. They analyzed political structures and biological capabilities and technological advantages and cultural tendencies of every species they could find information about. His voice was steady and calm, because he had practiced this explanation, even though he never thought he would actually have to give it. The Vexrathi delegate, whose name was something unpronounceable, that the translator rendered as Crystal Song, spoke up. Her crystalline body was glowing an angry red, and she said this sounded remarkably like intelligence gathering for warfare. Daniel shook his head and corrected her politely. He said it was intelligence gathering for survival, and that there was a difference that mattered. He told the assembled delegates about a human saying that went hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. He explained that Earth hoped for peaceful integration into the council, but they prepared for every other possibility, because that was how humans had survived, long enough to reach the stars. New voice joined the conversation, and it belonged to Ambassador Chen Wu from the Helian Collective. The Helians were known for being philosophical and thoughtful rather than aggressive, and Chen Wu had a reputation for asking questions that made people think deeply about their assumptions. He asked Daniel if he was saying that Earth really had contingency plans for every species, and suggested that this must be an exaggeration. Lisa stood up next to Daniel and said it was not an exaggeration at all. She explained that the Earth Strategic Assessment Division had active contingency files for all 73 council species plus an additional 47 species that had provisional or observer status. The chamber erupted. again, and Daniel watched as delegates began communicating frantically with their home governments. He could see the concern spreading through the room like ripples in water. Some species were demanding immediate explanations, while others were already calculating what this meant for their own security. The smaller species looked worried because if Earth had plans for everyone, then maybe other species did too, and they had just never admitted it. The larger military powers looked insulted because how dared this newcomer species presume to have plans against civilizations that had been powerful for millennia? Ambassador Zexthal spoke again, and his tone carried both anger and something that might have been curiosity. He demanded to know what humans could possibly plan against species that had 10,000 years more experience. He pointed out that the Krivian Empire had weapons that could sterilize Earth's entire planet from orbit, and asked what contingency could possibly prepare for that level of technological superiority. Daniel had been waiting for this question because it was the obvious one, and he had an answer ready. Daniel agreed calmly that the Krivians did indeed have orbital plasma arrays. He mentioned that these weapons had an effective range of approximately 40,000 kilometers and took 12 seconds to charge between shots. He said that Krivian fleets favored a formation that human analysts called sword pattern, with dreadnoughts at the center and cruisers in defensive positions. He noted that it was an excellent formation for projecting force and showing strength. Then he stopped talking and waited for Zexthal to process what he had just heard. The Krivian ambassador made a sound that the translator couldn't convert into words. His entire body went still in a way that Daniel's briefing suggested meant shock. The other delegates were watching this exchange with intense focus, because Daniel had just demonstrated that Earth knew specific details about Krivian military capabilities. Not vague general knowledge, but precise technical specifications and tactical doctrines. This changed the conversation from theoretical to very real very quickly. Daniel continued speaking because he had everyone's attention now. He addressed the Vexarathi and mentioned their quantum-entangled communication networks that made intercepting military coordination nearly impossible. He talked about their living crystal technology that could regenerate from damage. He turned to the Qualan and mentioned their ability to operate in environments that were lethal to most species, which gave them tactical advantages in certain situations. Then he asked if he should continue with the other 70 species in the room. Crystal Song declared that this was outrageous and accused Earth of spying on council members since their arrival. Her crystalline form was now glowing so brightly that Daniel had to resist the urge to squint. Lisa stepped forward and said they had not been spying but studying publicly available information and running strategic simulations. She pointed out that everything Daniel had mentioned was either common knowledge or could be derived from published council records and observed military exercises. The information was all legal to access and analyze. Daniel raised his hand for attention and said that perhaps they should clarify what these contingencies actually contained, because there seemed to be some misunderstanding about their purpose. He could see that some delegates were beginning to calm down slightly, while others were still processing the implications. The mood in the chamber was shifting from outrage to wary curiosity. They wanted to know more even if they didn't want to admit it. The council arbiter dimmed the ambient lighting, which was a signal that everyone had to pay attention. Lux announced that the human ambassador would continue without interruption, and that questions would follow afterward. Daniel nodded his thanks and prepared to explain exactly what Earth meant by contingency planning. He gestured to Lisa, who began setting up a holographic display above their delegation section. The display showed a complex flowchart with numerous branching paths and scenarios. It looked complicated because it was complicated, but Daniel was going to make it as clear as possible. He said this was a simplified version of their contingency framework. He explained that for each species, Earth maintained 4 primary categories of protocols, which were diplomatic, economic, defensive, and worst-case scenarios. The moment he said worst-case scenarios, the room tensed again. Morpheus from the Qualan spoke up and his water chamber rippled. He said worst case meant military action, and Daniel could hear the accusation in his translated voice. Daniel shook his head and said it meant survival scenarios if peaceful coexistence became impossible. He emphasized that these were contingencies they hoped never to use. They existed in the same category as evacuation plans for natural disasters or protocols for first contact with hostile unknown species. They were insurance policies, not declarations of intent. Daniel changed the holographic display to show a specific example and he chose the Krivian Empire because Zexthal was still staring at him with those compound eyes. He explained that their diplomatic contingencies for the Krivians included strategies for negotiation and cultural exchange programs and conflict mediation. The economic contingencies covered trade agreements and resource sharing and economic partnerships that would benefit both species. The defensive contingencies included protocols for protecting human interests if Krivian policy became aggressive toward Earth. He spoke clearly and methodically because he wanted everyone to understand that these plans were comprehensive, not just military. Focused, Ambassador Zexthal leaned forward and demanded to know about the worst-case scenario. His translator made him sound both angry and genuinely curious. Daniel met his gaze and said that in the statistically unlikely event that the Krivian Empire declared war on Earth, they had identified 43 potential vulnerabilities in Krivian military doctrine. He said they had also identified 17 diplomatic relationships that Earth could leverage for mediation, and 12 neutral species who might serve as intermediaries to stop the conflict before it escalated. Then he mentioned that human analysts had developed 3 theoretical weapon systems specifically designed to counter Krivian plasma arrays, without requiring superior technology. The Krivian ambassador's translator went silent for a long moment. Everyone in the chamber was watching this interaction, because it was becoming clear that Earth had done far more homework than anyone realized. Finally, Zexthal spoke and asked about the 43 vulnerabilities with a tone that suggested he both wanted and didn't want to know the answer. Daniel said that Krivian military tradition emphasized honor and direct confrontation, which was admirable, but created predictable patterns. He explained that Krivian supply lines followed established routes for efficiency, and that their command structure, while effective, had clear hierarchies that could be disrupted. He said these were observations that any competent strategic analyst would make after studying publicly available information about Krivian military exercises. Lisa added that they should note these contingencies also included 43 identified strengths in Krivian military capability that would make direct confrontation extremely inadvisable for Earth. She said the entire point was to avoid conflict by understanding exactly what they would face and how impossibly difficult it would be. The goal was never to fight, but to know enough that fighting would never become necessary. Daniel appreciated her addition because it reinforced that these plans were defensive in nature. Ambassador Chen Wu spoke up, and his tone was more curious than accusatory. He asked if Earth had similar detailed analyses for all the Council species. Daniel confirmed that yes, they did. He used the Helians as an example and said their strength lay in coalition building and philosophical diplomacy. He explained that any conflict with Helians would likely be political rather than military, so Earth's contingencies focused primarily on maintaining positive relations and preparing for diplomatic maneuvering, rather than weapons development. Chen Wu seemed satisfied with this answer, and Daniel could see him thinking about the implications. The Qualan ambassador Morpheus made a rippling sound that the translator interpreted as amusement. He said that Daniel was either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish to admit all of this. He asked if Daniel realized that he had just made Earth a target by revealing how much they knew about everyone. Daniel had expected this concern, and he was ready with an answer. He said that on the contrary, being transparent about Earth's preparedness removed the mystique and mystery. He explained that everyone now knew Earth took its security seriously and wouldn't be an easy target for opportunistic aggression. But they also knew that Earth had invested just as much effort in diplomatic and economic planning as in military contingencies. Smaller delegate came forward, and Daniel recognized her as Ambassador Kara from the Trill Collective. The Trill were an insectoid species that didn't have much military power compared to giants like the Krivians or the Vexrathi. Kara asked what weapon systems could possibly threaten species with millennia of technological advancement. It was a fair question because, on paper, Earth should be hopelessly outmatched by almost everyone in the room. Daniel smiled slightly and said that humans had been fighting each other creatively for their entire history. He pointed out that when you've spent 10,000 years with superior technology, you might forget what it's like to win through unconventional thinking. He said humans were excellent at asymmetric warfare. Lisa pulled up historical data on the display showing examples from Earth's military history. She showed how smaller forces had defeated larger ones through unconventional tactics, and how technological disadvantages had been overcome through creative thinking. She mentioned guerrilla warfare and psychological operations and economic pressure and information warfare. She explained that humans had spent thousands of years figuring out how to fight enemies who were stronger or better equipped. The delegates watched the display with varying degrees of interest and concern. Daniel continued explaining that asymmetric warfare meant finding advantages where none seemed to exist. He said it meant attacking supply lines instead of armies, and targeting morale instead of soldiers and exploiting political divisions instead of fighting battles. He mentioned that several of the theoretical weapon systems they had developed didn't rely on having better technology, but on using existing technology in unexpected ways. He gave an example of how Earth's analysis of Vexarathi quantum communication had led to theoretical jamming methods that used the crystal's own properties against them. Crystal Song's color shifted to purple, which Lisa had told him meant she was thinking deeply about something. Ambassador. Chen Wu stood and said this discussion had revealed something important about human psychology. He said it seemed to go beyond mere caution, and suggested a mindset fundamentally different from council norms. Daniel nodded because Chen Wu had just given him an opening to explain the core concept behind everything Earth had done. He said the ambassador was absolutely correct, and that it reflected something humans called healthy paranoia. Several delegates made sounds of confusion because paranoia was generally not considered a positive trait. Lisa explained that Earth's history was marked by repeated cycles of conflict and cooperation and betrayal and reconciliation. She said humans had seen hundreds of distinct civilizations rise and fall on their own planet. They had fought wars over resources and ideology and religion and territory and sometimes simple misunderstanding. The Vexarathi delegate observed coldly that this did not recommend Earth species for council membership. Daniel agreed that perhaps it didn't, but said it had taught humans valuable lessons about survival. He walked toward the center of the chamber, which was a calculated move to make himself visible to all delegates. He said that when Earth developed faster than light travel and made contact with the Council, they faced a choice. They could assume the best and trust completely in the Council's 11,000 cycles of peace and focus, entirely on integration. Or they could acknowledge that peace maintained by superior species might not automatically extend protection to the newest and weakest member. He let that statement hang in the air for a moment. Morpheus asked if Earth had considered the Council species as threats. Daniel shook his head and said they considered everyone as unknowns. He explained that unknowns were variables in an equation that determined human survival. So Earth did what humans do best, which was study and plan and prepare for every possibility they could imagine. He said this wasn't about distrust, but about responsibility to their own species' continued existence. Lisa brought up more data on the holographic display, and Daniel could see the delegates leaning forward to get a better look. She explained that Earth's Strategic Assessment Division employed 15,000 analysts across multiple disciplines. These people studied xenobiology and military history and political science and economics and cultural anthropology. Every piece of information that was available through legal channels got analyzed and cross-referenced and turned into actionable intelligence. The number seemed to shock several delegates, because Ambassador Zexthal asked if 15,000 people were really dedicated just to intelligence gathering. Daniel corrected him and said they were dedicated to understanding, not just gathering intelligence. He emphasized this because the distinction mattered more than most species seem to realize. He said that understanding why the Vexarathi valued artistic expression in their crystal formations was just as important as knowing their weapons capabilities. He explained that knowing the Qualan had 3 different castes with different social roles helped Earth diplomats avoid cultural mistakes. This wasn't just about preparing for war, but about preparing for everything, including peace and friendship and cooperation. He gestured to Lisa, who brought up a new display that showed an overwhelming array of planning documents. Daniel said they had contingency plans for solar flares disrupting galactic communications. They had plans for pandemics that might cross species barriers. They had plans for economic collapse and for first contact with new species, and for scientific breakthroughs that might change everything. They had plans for environmental catastrophes and for technological singularities and for diplomatic incidents. He said they had plans for scenarios where Earth got attacked and scenarios where they needed to defend allies and scenarios where they needed to evacuate their entire species to a new world. Ambassador Kara from the Trill Collective leaned forward, and her compound eyes reflected the holographic display and interesting patterns. She said this seemed exhausting, and asked how humans functioned while preparing for every possible disaster. Daniel smiled genuinely for the first time since this whole discussion started. He said that was the interesting part because humans didn't let the planning paralyze them. They prepared for the worst and then focused their actual efforts on building the best possible future. While the Strategic Assessment Division maintained these contingencies, the vast majority of Earth's diplomatic corps was working on cultural exchanges and trade agreements and scientific cooperation and building genuine friendships across species. Lisa added that only about 2% of Earth's diplomatic resources went to contingency planning. The other 98% went to positive engagement with the galactic community. She pulled up statistics showing how many cultural exchange programs Earth had initiated, and how many joint scientific projects they were participating in, and how many trade agreements they had negotiated. The numbers were impressive, and they told a story of a species genuinely trying to integrate and contribute. Several delegates seemed surprised by this information. Ambassador Chen Wu asked the question that Daniel knew was coming. He wanted to know why Earth had mentioned these plans at all if their goal was peaceful integration. He pointed out that Daniel could have kept quiet and avoided this entire disruption. Daniel said it was because Morpheus had asked what insights Earth might have on conflict prevention. He explained that the honest answer was that Earth's best prevention strategy was thorough preparation combined with transparent intent. Now everyone knew that attacking Earth would be costly even for advanced species. But they also knew Earth wasn't planning aggression, but rather planning survival while hoping for cooperation. The chamber had grown quieter as delegates processed this information. Daniel could see that the initial outrage was fading and being replaced by thoughtful consideration. Some delegates were still suspicious, but others seemed to be re-evaluating their assumptions about the strange humans who had joined the council only 3 years ago. The Vexrathi delegate Crystal Song had shifted from angry red to contemplative purple. The Krivian ambassador Zexthal had stopped waving his arms around and was sitting still in a way that suggested deep thought. Morpheus spoke again, and his water chamber rippled with what seemed like genuine curiosity. He said that Earth's approach revealed something unexpected about human nature. He asked if this kind of comprehensive planning was normal for humans, or if it was specific to their diplomatic and military organizations. Daniel said it was actually very normal for humans. He explained that human parents planned for their children's education years in advance. Human businesses created 5-year plans and 10-year plans and contingency plans for market changes. Human governments maintained emergency protocols for natural disasters and disease outbreaks and economic crises. Lisa added that human individuals often had personal contingency plans too. She said many humans had savings accounts for emergencies and insurance policies for unexpected events and backup plans for their careers. She explained that this kind of forward thinking was taught to human children from a young age. The concept of being prepared wasn't just for militaries and governments, but was woven into human culture at every level. This seemed to fascinate several delegates who came from species with very different approaches to planning and risk management. Ambassador Chen Wu said this explained a great deal about human behavior that had puzzled him since Earth joined the Council. He mentioned that human diplomats always seemed to have alternative proposals ready when negotiations hit obstacles. They always had backup options and contingency suggestions. He had thought it was just good diplomatic training, but now he understood it was something deeper in human psychology. Daniel confirmed that yes, humans generally felt uncomfortable without backup plans, because their history had taught them that things often went wrong in unexpected ways. Zexthal spoke up and said that Krivian culture valued honor and directness. He said they found it difficult to understand why humans spent so much energy planning for things that might never happen. Daniel nodded respectfully and said that was a cultural difference worth understanding. He explained that humans had a saying about hoping for the best while preparing for the worst. Another human saying was that an ounce of prevention was worth a pound of cure. These concepts were so fundamental to human thinking that they had dozens of sayings about preparation and planning. The Krivian ambassador tilted his head in a gesture that Daniel's briefing said indicated consideration of new information. Zexthal asked if Daniel was suggesting that this paranoid planning actually helped maintain peace, rather than threatening it. Daniel said yes, that was exactly what he was suggesting. He explained that when everyone knew that everyone else was prepared, the cost of aggression went up significantly. When Earth's potential enemies knew that humans had studied their tactics and developed counters, it made attacking Earth much less appealing. But when Earth's potential friends knew that humans had invested just as much in diplomatic and economic planning, it made cooperation more attractive. Crystal, Song spoke, and her voice chimed with crystalline clarity. She said that the Vexrathi had experience with species who prepared for conflict. She mentioned the Devourer Wars from 3,000 cycles ago, when an extra-galactic threat had nearly destroyed several Council species. She said the Vexrathi had survived because they adapted quickly and prepared better defenses. She admitted that perhaps the Council had grown complacent during the long peace that followed. Her crystalline form glowed with thoughtful orange light. Daniel seized on this opening and said that complacency was the real danger. He explained that 11,000 cycles of peace was wonderful, but it could make species forget that threats could emerge from unexpected places. He pointed out that the current territorial disputes in the Outer Rim had caught many species by surprise because they had stopped thinking about expansion conflicts. Earth's fresh perspective as newcomers let them see patterns that longtime Council members might have missed. Their contingency planning wasn't paranoid, but rather realistic about the fact that peace required constant maintenance. The Council Arbiter pulsed brightly and drew everyone's attention back to the center of the chamber. Lux announced that this revelation had created significant concern and that the Council needed to deliberate on appropriate responses. The floating energy being said that before they adjourned, any delegate could make a formal motion if they wished. Daniel felt his stomach tighten because formal motions could lead to sanctions or even expulsion from the Council. He had gambled by being honest, and now he would find out if that gamble would pay off or cost Earth everything. Ambassador Chen Wu rose slowly from his seat, and Daniel watched him carefully. The Helian delegate carried considerable influence in the Council because his species had a reputation for wisdom and fair judgment. Whatever Chen Wu said next would shape how other species responded. The chamber fell silent as everyone waited to hear what motion the Helian would propose. Chen Wu looked directly at Daniel and then turned to address the entire Council. He said that he moved for the Council to conduct a formal inquiry into Earth's intelligence gathering, practices and contingency planning to ensure compliance with Council regulations. Daniel felt Lisa tense beside him, and he knew what she was thinking. A formal inquiry could tie Earth up in bureaucratic procedures for years and damage their reputation permanently. But then Chen Wu continued speaking, and Daniel realized the Helian wasn't finished. Chen Wu said he also moved that the Council commission a comprehensive study of Earth's planning methodologies for potential adaptation by other species. He said that if he could speak frankly, the human approach to preparedness, while initially alarming, revealed gaps in the Council's own strategic thinking that needed to be addressed. This statement caused immediate reaction throughout the chamber. Several delegates started talking at once, and the translation system struggled to keep up. Ambassador Zexthal stood up with all 6 arms, gesturing, and demanded to know if Chen Wu was serious. The Crevian asked if the Helian really wanted to adopt the paranoid practices of a species that had barely left their home system. His tone suggested he thought this was the most ridiculous suggestion he had ever heard. Chen Wu remained calm and turned to face Zexthal directly. The Helian ambassador said he wished to learn from a species that survived to reach space, despite having no natural advantages. He pointed out that humans had no armor like the Crevians and no regeneration like the Vexrathi, and no environmental adaptations like the Qualan. He said humans were physically weak and technologically behind, but they were standing here among species thousands of years more advanced. Chen Wu asked Daniel a direct question about how many times in Earth's history humans had faced extinction-level events. Daniel glanced at Lisa, who quickly pulled up the data on her datapad. He said that depending on how you defined extinction-level events, Earth had faced between 5 and 12 of them. He listed major asteroid impacts and supervolcanic eruptions and ice ages, and several near-apocalyptic wars during humanity's nuclear age. He explained that each time humans had come close to complete destruction, but had survived through adaptation and preparation, and sometimes just luck. The delegates listened to this list with varying expressions of surprise and concern. Chen Wu said that here, Daniel stood among the stars representing a species that had clawed its way up from repeated disasters. He mentioned that his own species, the Helians, had evolved on a paradise world with abundant resources and gentle climate. He admitted that perhaps they had grown complacent in their peace and prosperity. He suggested that there might be value in learning how species without advantages learn to survive. Several other delegates were nodding now, and Daniel could see the conversation shifting in a direction he had not anticipated. Morpheus from the Quallen made his water chamber ripple thoughtfully. He said the human made a point that deserved consideration. He pointed out that the Council's peace had lasted 11,000 cycles, which was remarkable, but the galaxy was vast and new threats emerged constantly. He asked when was the last time the Council had truly prepared for a major crisis. The question hung in the air because none of the delegates seemed to have a ready answer. The truth was that the Council had been reactive rather than proactive for a very long time. Crystal Song from the Vex Rathi spoke, and her color had shifted from purple to a softer blue. She said her species remembered the Devourer Wars from 3,000 cycles past. She explained that the Vex Rathi had nearly fallen to an extragalactic threat because they had grown comfortable in their superiority. She said only desperate adaptation and last-minute preparation had saved them from destruction. She admitted that perhaps they had forgotten that lesson over the following 3,000 years of uninterrupted peace. Her tone suggested she was genuinely reconsidering her initial anger at Earth's revelation. Ambassador Kara from the Trill Collective clicked forward on her legs and spoke in her small but clear voice. She said her species occupied a vulnerable position in the Council because they lacked the military might of larger species. She said the Trill had always relied on the Council's protection, but maybe they should consider more comprehensive planning for their own security. She looked at Daniel with what he interpreted as respect and asked if Earth would be willing to share some of their planning frameworks. Several other smaller species made sounds of agreement. Daniel saw his opportunity and took it. He said that if the Council allowed it, Earth would be willing to share their planning methodologies with any interested species. He clarified that they would not share specific contingencies against individual species, because that would be counterproductive. But they could share the frameworks for strategic assessment and the processes for scenario development and the techniques for identifying vulnerabilities and strengths. He said a galaxy where every species was prepared for crisis was a galaxy less likely to face catastrophic collapse. Lisa stood beside Daniel and added that they could organize workshops through the Council's educational programs. She said Earth had experts in strategic thinking and crisis planning and scenario development who could teach these skills to other species. She emphasized that strong prepared neighbors made better allies than weak vulnerable ones. She said if everyone knew that everyone else had contingencies, then the deterrent effect would multiply while reducing temptation for opportunistic aggression. Her logic was sound and several delegates were clearly considering the implications. Ambassador Zexthal was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke in a tone that suggested he was struggling between his initial anger and grudging respect. He said that Daniel was either the most dangerous being the Council had admitted, or the most valuable. He admitted he had not decided which. Daniel smiled slightly and said hopefully both because dangerous to enemies but valuable to friends seemed like the ideal position. To his surprise, Zexthal's translator emitted a sound that might have been a laugh. The Krivian ambassador said he would like to see these 43 vulnerabilities Daniel had mentioned earlier. He emphasized this would be confidential, of course. Daniel said he believed that could be arranged and suggested that perhaps Krivian military theorists could review Earth's assessment. He explained that humans might have missed important factors, and a professional review would help make the analysis more accurate. Zexthal seemed pleased by this suggestion and agreed immediately. The Council Arbiter pulsed with bright light and announced that the chamber would recess for 6 standard hours. Lux said this would allow delegates to consult with their governments before proceeding to formal votes on the motions that had been proposed. Daniel felt exhausted as the tension finally started to drain from his body. Lisa touched his arm and whispered that she could not believe he had actually told them everything. She said the Strategic Assessment Division was going to have a collective panic attack when they heard about this. Daniel whispered back that maybe so, but they had just turned a potential diplomatic disaster into an unexpected opportunity. He said sometimes the best defense was radical honesty, especially when you had nothing to hide except the specific details. As delegates began filing out of the chamber, several of them approached the human section. Daniel was surprised to see that most of them looked curious rather than hostile. Ambassador Chen Wu was among the last to approach, and he looked at Daniel with an expression that was hard to read. The Helian said that Daniel had taken an enormous risk today. Daniel corrected him and said it was a calculated risk. Chenwu smiled and said that humans seemed to be good at calculated risks. He said he looked forward to learning more about Earth's approach to survival. He added that something told him Earth's presence in the Council would prove far more influential than anyone had anticipated when they approved humanity's membership 3 years ago. Daniel thanked him and watched as the Helian delegate walked away. Lisa and Daniel gathered their materials and prepared to leave the chamber. Daniel looked around at the vast space that held representatives from dozens of worlds. Each species had thousands of years of history and development and wisdom.